Well, if I appreciate Anna being here, and as we were, she had emailed a few months ago talking about being able to make this announcement at some point. I thought it fit well within this open-handed series. As we talk about being open-handed, engaging in compassionate ministry, I think we all realize that there's a bit of a price to pay. There's always a price to pay if you're going to be helping somebody, correct? There's going to be some kind of a price. Now, we usually think of price in the sense of resources, even some of the ones I talked about in offering time of there's resources like time or talent. If you have a particular talent, you can help somebody with that talent. Could you just take care of that echo? There's a bit of an echo. Keep coming back to me. If you could take care of that, that'd be great. So there's a particular price you have to pay: resources, time, or your talent, or your treasure. That if you're going to be generous to somebody, you give of your money. Now, you may be saying, oh, come on, Joel, it's Father's Day. I brought my dad. You're not going to talk about, the price you have to pay to be generous. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. That there is a price to pay, but it is beyond, I think, just resources of time, talent, and treasure. But hey, if you did invite your dad and they're here, guess what? They know there's a price to pay. I had to pay for diapers. That was great for our budget when, the kids finally got out of diapers, There's a price to pay in doctor's visits and vaccinations and school clothes and new shoes and stuff you break because you're stupid. Your dad knows that. He knows there's a price to pay, anytime you're going to help somebody. And then there's college and car insurance. Your dad knows this, so he'll do fine with this message. When it comes to following Jesus, engaging in his mission, we sometimes forget to talk about the price that we have to pay. I think a lot of times we just think of, if we follow Jesus, my life will be enhanced. And he certainly does enhance our life, but there's a price to pay for that. And the enhancement is not always what we think of as enhancement. We think it's just going to be easy going, but there's a price to pay in following Jesus and his mission. I was recently watching a documentary called Facing Darkness, and it's the documentaries about the Ebola crisis that was in 2014. And I don't know if you remember that in West Africa, where really it was just a handful of Christian agencies that began fighting Ebola. Ebola is incredibly dangerous, it spreads quickly. To treat patients, they would have to get in full hazmat suits, and everywhere there was a seam, they would duct tape. They would wear full-on masks and to treat them. The disease itself is horrific. You get a high fever, and then you just begin hemorrhaging everywhere in your body. And they said the telltale sign is just when you begin bleeding out your eyes. And then you just die this painful, excruciating death. And it was beginning to spread in 2014. In fact, if you may remember, we shut down from people being able to travel to certain countries and travel back from certain countries because it was just spreading so quickly. One of the Christian doctors that was on the front lines, Dr. Kent Brantley, ended up contracting the disease. And maybe you remember this. They ended up finding a special plane once they kind of got through the red tape of, do we bring him to the States? There was an experimental drug that had never been tested on humans, only monkeys, and they ended up testing it on him, and it really brought him back from the brink of death several times, but he was still in horrible condition. They flew him in a special self-contained plane where this cargo unit has its own air filtration system. They brought him to Emory University and ends up surviving. Well, in this documentary, they ask him about his faith and what it cost to follow Jesus and if his faith healed him. I want you to listen to what he says. Let's go ahead and play that track right now.
People have asked me, do I think my faith saved me? Is that what healed me? In a very real way, it was my faith, it was our attempt to follow Christ that got me Ebola. And that changes my perspective on faith. Faith is not something that makes you safe.
Faith is not something that makes you safe, he says. In fact, in one part of the video, they say, people ask me if faith healed me, and he says, in a very real way, the reason I got Ebola in the first place was because I had faith. That following Jesus put me on the front lines where I actually contracted a disease that could have killed me. Now, that's not a popular message when we talk about following Jesus and the price to follow Jesus. You know, for Kent Brantley, his faith didn't heal him of Ebola, he says, but in a real way, it was the reason he got Ebola. There's a price to pay when we're following Jesus and his mission, particularly in, like Dr. Kent Brantley's case, if we're going to follow Jesus to the point of following his mission to the poor and the outsider. Now again, when I think of paying a price, probably like you, I think of resources like time, talent, and treasure. And those are real prices we're going to pay to be involved in Jesus' mission. We'll have to give our time and our talent and our treasure. But there is another price to pay besides just resources. And I want us to look at a price that Jesus paid right after he gave his mission statement. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 4. As you turn to Luke 4, I want to remind you what we learned last week about Jesus' mission statement. Jesus said that he was God's anointed. He had unrolled a scroll in a synagogue, in a Jewish congregation, that he was handed. And it just so happened that that scroll was a 700-year-old prophecy that said God is going to send a rescuer who is going to give good news to the poor, and then he's going to demonstrate that good news to the poor. He's actually going to say, this is the good news, and what the good news is, he's going to release everybody who's oppressed. The poor, those who are physically oppressed, the blind, those who are spiritually oppressed, who are in bondage to their sin, or in bondage to demons, or in bondage to bitterness, he is going to release them. After he says that mission statement, that he's been anointed, that he has an anointed mission to proclaim good news to the poor and release the oppressed, right after he does that, we see that he pays a price for his own mission. I think it's important for us to get that, because so often we don't talk about this. In fact, I've preached this passage many, many times, Luke 4. I've heard it preached many, many times. I don't know that I've heard anybody go beyond their teaching to the line where Jesus rolls the scroll back, puts it down, and says, today this is fulfilled in your hearing. Like, I don't know that I've ever heard anybody finish the story. I've never finished the story. Or I may have read it, but I never taught on it. And it's very important because it shows us that there's a price to pay for following Jesus in his mission. And all too often, we either pay the price once and we say, I'll never do that again, or because of the price that we see up front, we don't get engaged in Jesus' mission. And by not doing that, or by paying the price and saying, I'll never do it again, we are in danger of having hard and calloused hearts to the very people Jesus wants to reach. So let's take a look at this, Luke 4, and let's see if we can find out this price that Jesus paid that we'll also have to pay if we're going to join his mission. And we're going to see if maybe you all and myself have paid the price. If we haven't, why not? If we have paid this price, have we allowed it to harden our hearts to the poor? Luke 4:22, all spoke well of Jesus. This is right after he got done reading the scroll and saying, today this prophecy is fulfilled. In other words, I'm the guy that's anointed to do this. God has called me to do it. All spoke well of him and were amazed at his gracious words. Isn't this Joseph's son, they said? Because remember, Nazareth was his hometown, and this is happening in his hometown. Jesus said to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself, and you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we've heard you did in Capernaum, which was a neighboring town. I will stop there. Keep your finger there. We're going to keep going on this. But Jesus, says, today this prophecy is being fulfilled, and all the townspeople are like, man, this is our hometown boy. This guy's one of us. And we've been waiting thousands of years for the Messiah, the rescuer, to come, and he's our guy. He's Joseph's son. We know the guy, grew up with him, played ball with him, went to school with him, did woodworking with him at his father's woodworking shop. We know him. And not only, is he our guy, there's going to be some benefits for our town. You know, the phrase there, physician, heal thyself, as I studied that this week and looked at what Bible scholars said, it's not so much that they're saying that Jesus needed healed, it's more that he's saying, heal your own. Heal your own people. Heal your own town. Come do some cool stuff here. Like, we're going to have God's favor. Like, God's favor is going to be really good here. We're going to be his favorite because it's our town that produced the Messiah. You know, in first century Israel, that the country was ripe with nationalism. Israelites just assumed that they were more favored by God than anyone else. They expected the Messiah and God's appointed and anointed rescuer to come kick out the Roman occupiers, to punish all the Gentiles and save all the Jews. It was a self-centered nationalism that led to racism and even pride of place. And you even hear that pride of place in them, that our town is better than anybody else's because Jesus and God is with us. But they were mistaken, and Jesus corrects their mistake, and in so doing, he pays a price for identifying with the poor, the oppressed, and the outsider. Look at verse 24. This is Jesus still speaking. Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time. He's referring to about a 900-year-old true story about prophets, Elijah and Elisha, that existed in Israel's history. They would have been very familiar with these stories. He says, I assure you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time. When the sky was shut for 3.5 years, there was no rain, there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah wasn't sent to any of them. He wasn't sent to his own countrymen, those widows, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. Jesus is starting to meddle. It doesn't feel like meddling to us, because my guess is you and I don't sit around thinking about, you know, Elijah and Elisha and Sidon and Zarephath and Syria, right? We don't know any of these stories. But for them, Jesus was stirring something. He was stirring the pot. He was saying, listen, your vision of my mission is too narrow. And the people you think I'm supposed to reach is too narrow of a group. He says, remember from your own history, there were plenty of widows in Israel, but God doesn't just love Israel. He actually sent Elijah to a widow's house in Lebanon. And there, because of the famine, she was running out of food. He did a miracle where every time she went to the flour jar and every time she went to the oil jar, there was always flour coming out and oil coming out of the jar. She never ran out. Lest you think that's fairy tale stuff, many of you know the Bennetts that up until recently, they've moved for a job, but they attended church here, and they ran with a foster agency. They ran a foster agency in China. If you've seen the video, Father of Lights, there's another couple running an orphanage in China in that video, young couple that moved there, and they talk about kind of their desperate situation and what happened and how the Holy Spirit empowered them. The Bennetts became good friends with that family. For about 4.5 years, that family, as they were running their orphanage, every time they went to the refrigerator, there was milk in the refrigerator. It never ran out, and they never figured out how it got there, except it was miraculous. So not fairy tale stuff, like real-life people that we know type thing have experienced this. Jesus says, you thought the mission was just for your town or for your country, but don't you remember Elijah? Now he really gets meddling. I mean, it's one thing to go to a foreign country and help widows, right? But what about when you help your enemy? Now Jesus is really poking the bear, right? Because he says this, or don't you remember Elisha? Lots of people had skin disease and leprosy in Israel's time, but none of them got healed under the ministry of Elisha except one, but he wasn't even an Israelite. He was Naaman the Syrian. Naaman was a general in Israel, in the enemy of Israel's army. They were regularly attacking Israel at that very time, and this guy got leprosy, and he realized maybe the one true God is really the one true God. I'll go to his prophet Elisha and see if he'll heal me, and Elisha healed the enemy. What do you think the people's response was to Jesus when he says, My mission to the poor and the outsider and the oppressed isn't just to the poor and oppressed like you, or in your town, or even in your country. I mean, I can imagine them going, wait a second, you mean we got to go to the immoral people? We got to go to the people who don't even worship God. They worship like pagan gods. I mean, they do all kinds of heinous things in their temples. They have temple prostitutes, and they mix worship of their idols with prostitution. It's just a message. I mean, surely you don't mean we go to the Greek outsider or to the Syrian or the Lebanese or surely you don't mean the Romans. I mean, they took over our country and they've treated us horribly, and you don't mean we go to their poor and to their outsiders and to their oppressed, do you? I think they figured out that that's exactly what Jesus meant. It didn't go over too well that day. I don't think it goes over well today, do you? Like, it's one thing to say, let's be generous to the poor, but most of us in our head, we have a grid and we say, well, this is who the poor is, and they're people like me or like us or from my family or from my friendships or my city. I remember talking once to, I'm going to synthesize about 6 different conversations so I wouldn't reveal any one person on this one. I talked to numerous persons from a church that was changing their whole style because the neighborhood around them had changed. 20, 30 years ago, it was a white upper middle class neighborhood, and the whole place changed. And then it had many different people, a lot of Hispanics, a lot of African Americans had moved in, even some other nationalities had moved in. And the church made a conscious decision to change their style of worship and preaching so that it would reflect the neighborhood more and that they would reach their neighbors more. Jesus kind of said that, right? Love your neighbors as yourself. I'm going to synthesize several conversations I had with people that left that church. And the conversation usually started this way. I'm not racist, but... I remember several people said, well, I used to work with somebody like this, and I don't want to go to church like that. Several of the conversations said, I grew up in a part of town that had lots of people of color, and it's not that I don't like them, I just don't want to be around them. The mission, Jesus' mission, went outside of what they were comfortable with. The people that he was going to reach, it went outside who they were comfortable with. Sometimes the grid is particular sins. It's not race. Sometimes the grid that we kind of filter people out on is Jesus says, I want to reach these people and these people and these people, no matter what their sin struggle is. And sometimes we narrow Jesus' mission by going, I just have a real disdain for people who this. I don't want to work with drunk people because my dad always got drunk and treated my mom horribly, and I just have a real disdain for. I'm not going to help drunks. I see what addicts are doing to our city, and they're selfish, and they're this, and they're that, and they're that. I'm not going to help them. I just don't have any use for them. And yet Jesus says, I've come with good news for all the oppressed, and all the poor, all the outsiders. So sometimes it's certain sins. I've had people who will say, they don't say it exactly like this on the front end, but essentially what they're saying is, I'm all for the metaphorical poor in spirit, but I don't like I just don't like the real poor. I don't want, it's messy, but yet Jesus says, I want to release everybody. His whole mission statement was good news to the poor. I don't know if you've ever heard this one. I've heard this one. I can't think of names right off the top of the bat, so if you've said this to me, I'm not thinking of you. But I've had people tell me, I don't understand why you guys support orphanages in foreign countries or missionaries when there's so much poor here. Do you hear the pride of place in that? Well, shouldn't Jesus be for us and ours first? Instead of others? You see, I think Jesus' mission says, well, just do both. Like help people you're close to and people you're not close to, people in your country and people outside of your country. It's quiet. Either I'm really boring or I've started meddling. Which one, Can I keep meddling? Is it okay? Good. Well, you're not going to like this. But there is a purpose. There is a reason to my madness because I'm trying to touch different groups so that you can begin to feel how Jesus' congregation felt that day. Can I pick a hot topic right now? Let me just meddle a little bit. Let me talk just a little bit about the immigrants. Complex issue, and I don't have a great solution, so please don't politicize it and say that they're simple. I don't have a simple solution. But it is hard to read Bible passages and not get it that God has a heart for the outsider, the foreigner, and the immigrant. Now, part of loving our neighbor is we need to make a safe country. Absolutely. And we need to protect people from terrorism. I absolutely get that. But it is hard to read Deuteronomy 10 and 24 and Leviticus 19, Leviticus 24, and not see that, you know what, instead of filtering solutions first as followers of Jesus, instead of filtering through a Democratic proposal or a Republican proposal, I think we need to work really, really hard, especially because so many messages come at us from so many different news organizations and social media. We need to work really, really, really hard to make sure we're first and foremost filtering our thoughts and our beliefs and our suggestions through the heart of God. And I don't find many Christians doing that. I find MSNBC or CNN or Fox News junkies or Facebook junkies or special groups or webpage junkies, and they just live in an echo chamber and they filter their thoughts all through that. And instead of Jesus' mission, which is, I've come for everybody. And of course, we're going to have to come up with solutions to complex problems. I'm not saying that. But as far as our heart and where we start, it needs to filter through the heart of Jesus. Are you beginning to understand why the congregation Jesus was speaking to got a little upset? He's meddling, right? Listen how upset they got. I hope you don't do this to me. Verse 28. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up and drove him out of the town and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. I'm just glad the church isn't built by Mount Pleasant. So what price did Jesus pay for his universal mission to everybody who's poor, everybody who's an outsider, everybody who's oppressed? I'll tell you the price he paid, and this is the price you and I will pay if we begin to identify with all outsiders, all oppressed, and all poor. The price he paid was rejection. He was rejected by his own people, his own town. No doubt relatives of Mary, so his own flesh and blood rejected him. They wanted to kill him. They flipped from speaking graciously of him to wanting to kill him, all because he challenged them with his mission to all the poor, all the oppressed, regardless of religion, race, nationality, or social status. Don't you just think that if we began to live that way and have that message, we'd be rejected too? Especially in this age of identity politics, where whatever your belief is, put you in some stereotypical category, and then I can no longer like you. Right? Isn't that where we're at? Don't you just think if we began to identify with all the oppressed, even on a personal level? If your friends have a disdain for strung-out addicts and you start ministering to addicts and inviting an addict friend to your social gathering, what do you think your friend's reaction would be? Or what if you're in the midst of a conversation? How many of us have been in conversations where somebody brings up either an economic or a racial stereotype, and you know it's wrong and you should say something, but we don't say it? Why? Because we're afraid of the price. And that price is rejection, right? What if you aligned yourself with the oppressed and the poor in conversations? What price would you begin to pay? I bet you'd pay the same price that Jesus paid. Rejection. See, our world does not like it when somebody says, yes, we need solutions and we need this and structure and systems, but let's not forget Jesus is for all the poor, all the oppressed, all of the outsiders, all of those who don't have a voice to protect themselves. Keep meddling? There's one brave person. So if you're a Democrat, What do you think the response would be if you ran in a national election and you made it as part of your platform that you were pro-life? What price do you think you'd pay? If you're a Republican and you ran a national election and you had a platform of, we're going to have compassionate immigrant reform. We're going to secure the borders, of course, but we're also going to make sure we take care of people in compassionate ways and give grace. What do you think the price would pay for either one of those candidates, Democrat or Republican? You're beginning to feel in your heart and your gut as the acid raises up. You're feeling what that congregation felt, aren't you? If so, then I've done my job. There's a price to pay for joining Jesus' mission to the poor. Now, I should say that we can have many different ideas how to solve those kind of issues. Please don't say there's just a cookie cutter, but it ought to emanate from the heart of Jesus first. That's what I'm saying, and his mission. There's a price to pay for joining Jesus' mission to the poor and the oppressed, and that price is often rejection. Think about it. Jesus not only was rejected because of his stance, he was actually rejected by the very people he'd come to save. He didn't just come to save everybody outside of Nazareth. He came to, when you're for everybody, when you're for all the poor, all the oppressed, everybody in bondage to bitterness or sin or to demonic powers or in bondage to economic poverty or enslaved by some other thing. I mean, when you're for everyone, you're for that group too. And that group rejected him. I bet we have some people that have experienced that. Do we have some people in the room that you have experienced times where the very people you were trying to help rejected you? You're trying to help somebody work through an issue of forgiveness, and they say, I can't, I'm going to hold on to my resentment. And they don't want to talk to you anymore. Trying to help a married couple reconcile some major differences, and they don't want your help because they don't want to be reconciled when it really comes down to it. You're helping somebody budget and get out of a generational cycle of poverty, and they won't follow the plan. They eventually don't want to see you because it's too much accountability. You ever been rejected by trying to help somebody while you're doing the mission of Jesus? Rejection. It's a price to pay for a mission to the poor and the oppressed, and that price is often rejection. There's a price to pay, but you know what? That crowd in Nazareth paid a much heavier price. They missed out on Jesus being in their town preaching the good news. They missed out on being released from whatever oppressed them. They missed out on joining Jesus' mission to the poor and the poor in spirit and to the oppressed. I can tell you there are exciting moments that happen when you stick to the mission of Jesus and you see somebody forgive somebody that's hurt them deeply and they're released from bitterness. I've seen those who are demonized be released from demonic powers. Seen over the long haul an addict make good decisions and after many ups and downs and finally string enough good decisions together that they actually begin to have freedom in their life. They missed out on all of that. Worst of all, they missed out on Jesus. Jesus said, as you do to the least of me, these brothers of mine, you've done it unto me. By going to the poor, they would have been ministering to Jesus and would have met Jesus face to face. As going to the oppressed, they would have seen Jesus in the least of these. They missed out on Jesus himself. How did Jesus respond to this rejection? Take a look at verse 30 and we'll end here. So they took him to the cliff, they're ready to throw him over, and they say, but he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. There is a price to pay for following Jesus' mission to the poor and the oppressed, and that is rejection. But there's also a reward, and that reward is Jesus himself. And he continued on his mission. In fact, if you would read the rest of chapter 4, you would see he goes to other towns And immediately he sees people who are released from the bondage of sin, people who have forgiveness of their sins, people who are in bondage to demons be set free, people who needed physical healing be healed. He continued on the mission that he was called to. He did not let rejection hold him back. There's a price to pay for following Jesus' mission to the poor and the oppressed, and that is rejection. But there's also